Hello and welcome to the Becoming Your Highest Self podcast. I'm your host, Macy Renee, and we are going on a journey together, my friend. If you've been looking for a podcast geared towards your growth, self-awareness, navigating your brain's daily mind drama, and deep inner work to become your highest and best self, you are in the perfect place. Let's get started. Hey, good morning. Welcome back to another episode of Becoming Your Highest Self podcast. I'm Macy, and I'm so excited to have you here with me. If you're brand new to the podcast, welcome. And if you're a returning listener and you come all the time, well, welcome back. So excited to have you here. So today, you guys, we are going to talk about the unawareness around cycles of trauma and how it shows up in your life when you're not dealing with it. I'm going to share my personal experiences with this and kind of the difference of, what I've learned over the years, especially what coaching taught me versus therapy. And really it's coming from conversations that have happened in the past few days. So I'm actually in Kentucky right now, which is why this podcast is releasing a little bit later than it normally would. I am visiting family. I came back for a baby shower. My very first coach is pregnant, and I was invited to the shower, but knowing that I lived in Vegas, she wasn't really expecting me to fly all the way here for that. But it's a big deal. When you have milestones in your life, it's a really big deal, at least to me. I take all of that very seriously. Weddings, baby showers, first birthdays. You just can never get that time back. And for me, I'm super sentimental. And so I surprised her, and it was just really nice to celebrate her and get to see this next milestone in her life. And so I'm excited. And I've been hanging out with some different friends and family members. I got to squeeze my niece. And over the last few days, we've talked a lot about just trauma and things that we've been through. And I guess I've been more reflective too, because now that I have, another niece and a niece that's related directly to me, I see things very differently. I also did as a, occupational therapist. I looked through the lens of like the work that I was doing as a coach and really thought about like how I wanted to show up, one day whenever I'm a mom. But now that I also have a niece and it's, a baby directly brought into the family, and, you kind of get, I don't know, you just reminisce on a lot of things that happened and ways that you want things to be different. And there's just been a lot of conversations coming up in the last few days, and I thought that I would bring that to the podcast and kind of just talk through it, because I think that, again, whenever you have conversations, you open up different portals, I guess you could say, to awareness within yourself. And when you have more self-awareness, you're able to recognize things. And when you're able to recognize things, you're able to work on healing those things and taking the steps necessary to change your life. So one of the reasons that this got brought up is that I was talking to a few people, and we were kind of talking about our youngest, most traumatic childhood memories. And this was something that I did a few years ago at a coaching retreat with my coach and her coach back in 2016. This retreat was like $3,000, and I didn't have the money to go. It was going to be for 3 days, so basically $1,000 a day to be coached by them. And of course, I was terrified. I didn't have a lot of money then. It wasn't in the account. I was just terrified. I had never spent that kind of money on myself. I mean, I had been getting coaching, but I had been paying a monthly fee. And so for a 3-day retreat to spend $3,000, I had all of the mind drama, which is normal. Anytime you decide you're going to better yourself and pay for a therapist or pay for a coach, I think you kind of shat your britches a little bit, because you might be used to spending money on yourself, like to buy concert tickets and food and necessities and things that you want from Amazon or things that you want from the mall, but you're not, I mean, most people are not conditioned to pay for something that is going to actually help their brain and actually help transform their life. So we don't prepare for those types of finances. And when we're not used to spending that money on something as vital as our brain, any stretch to do so feels incredibly daunting and scary sometimes. But I knew that I needed to be at this retreat. I could feel it in my spirit. So, although it was, to me, very expensive, especially at the time, I just felt this big pull. And when I got there, I was very reserved. I didn't really want to open up. However, I had already spent money on a retreat with my coach about 6 months prior. That was significantly less money, which I still thought was a big deal, by the way. Back then, it was a $500 retreat in Pigeon Forge. And after I paid that $500 for the retreat, full transparency, I had $85 left to my name. Granted, I was in my early 20s and just starting out in my career, but it was still scary. And I jumped with both, head first, essentially, or feet first into the water and spent the $500, even though it left me with $87 in my bank account. And I didn't take full advantage of being there, meaning that all of the other women were opening up and being vulnerable and sharing their stories. And while I found that to be so powerful, I was so afraid of anybody truly seeing me, knowing my different traumas, knowing the things that I had experienced in my life. I was just so afraid to let that side of myself out, because then it would look like I didn't have it all together. Like I wouldn't be able to keep up the persona, right? It was kind of like imposter syndrome. People were going to know that my life was much more complicated than I had let it out to be on social media back then. And so at that retreat, I sat back and I listened to everybody else, but I didn't ever come forth with my own story, my own information. It just felt too scary. So when I left that retreat, because of the impact that it made in my life just from listening, I vowed to myself that if I ever went on a retreat again, that I was not going to be silent, that I was going to make myself be very, very uncomfortable, and I was going to be authentic and show up and share my story so that someone could actually help me, and I wasn't going to feel like I have to do everything on my own in my life. So any of you all that are out there that are like, I can handle it, I can do it all, I don't need help, I'm not going to ask for anybody's help, I'll survive being able to do it on my own, but internally you're drowning, internally you're suffering, internally you look like you have it all together on the outside, but internally you're falling apart. I just want to let you know, I see you, I was you, and there is such a better life on the other side when you're ready. But I get it. I totally get it. So that next retreat had gone from the price of $500, which I thought was outrageous as like a 24-year-old, to $3,000 for the same amount of time. And it was really hard. But long story short, I figured out how to make it happen. And I showed up at this retreat. And as much as I wanted to do the exact same thing, I actually showed up for myself, and I allowed myself to share some of the most painful things. And that changed my life. So we were talking about this the other day, and I was sharing how at this retreat, my coaches made us do an exercise where we shared our youngest, most traumatic childhood memory. And every single woman that was there had to do so. And my youngest traumatic childhood memory was when I was 2 years old. And I can remember being in my bedroom, and a family member ran into my room, grabbed my arm, and told me that we had to go, and we had to go really quickly. And they were crying. And then as they grabbed me, we ran towards the front door, which was locked, and another member of the family was coming towards us, screaming very loudly. My family member was begging for them to stop screaming, begging for them to stop coming near us. And this family member had my wrist by one hand, and their other hand they were using to fidget, trying to fidget with the door without looking at the door, keeping their eye on the person coming towards us and begging for that person to stop. And once they finally got the door open, we ran to the car and we left. And I can remember everything up until the point where I got into the car. And then after that, my brain goes blank. But when I recall that story, I still see it in my mind. I know exactly where I was. I still remember the feeling. I still hear the sounds. I still feel the fear. And I'm 30 years old now. So this was when I was about 2 years old. And so it's been 28 years and I still feel it as fresh as the day that it happened. And so over the years, it's been random, but I'll recall that kind of memory, but it, for the most part, has been stored away in my subconscious, and I don't actively think about it. But at this retreat, we were encouraged to think of the young, like how young we were, and like when we had our first traumatic experience, and that was mine. And then we were taught that the age of your youngest traumatic childhood memory is the tipping point for how you make decisions in your life the rest of your life until you become aware. So basically what your brain does is it takes a snapshot of that very traumatic memory, and what it tries to do is keep you in safety and keep you out of ever experiencing that kind of traumatic memory ever again. So to give you like an example of like clients I've had in the past, if they were sexually molested as a child, and I know this may be triggering, especially if you went through something that's traumatic and awful, and for that I am sorry that you did. But I've had clients that if that is something that they experienced as a child, so then their brain remembers that as their youngest traumatic memory, okay? And then their brain goes into protection mode of how can we prevent this from happening ever again. And so at that point, their brain starts making decisions from that trauma. Okay, so what that will look like for them is maybe they start consuming a lot of food even when they're not hungry, and it's a coping mechanism, but what they're actually also doing is they're gaining weight because in their subconscious they're thinking, if I don't look like this anymore, nobody will ever touch me again. I won't be attractive. I won't be wanted. It's this subconscious pattern, right? And so their brain is using that trauma to try to avoid any more trauma ever again. So that starts at whatever age your youngest traumatic memory is. So I know that some of you right now might be trying to recall, like, what's my youngest, most traumatic memory, okay? And it usually correlates with exactly why you are where you are today, okay? So for me, again, my memory happened at 2, and I just went on living my life, never ever thinking about it, never knowing that that's what my brain was doing. When I got into my 20s and I became, an occupational therapist and everything, life was okay. Like there had been a lot of trauma that I had endured up to that point, but life was pretty okay on a day-to-day basis, although my ability to handle the stress of everyday life was super hard for me because I didn't have coping skills. Okay. Even after 17 years of therapy, like the way that I coped was internalizing everything and not really sharing anything with anyone outside of the therapist. So I felt very safe with all my therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists and things like that. But I didn't feel like I could open up to anybody else. Occasionally friends and stuff like that. But for the most part, the way that I handled life was like, put on a brave face, smile, be positive Patty all the time, and, just act like life is really good and act like you've got it all together. And really internally, I was internalizing a lot of stuff. So at this retreat, the next day after we've shared our youngest, most traumatic childhood memory, then they asked us to write a list of our I am statements. So like, I am pretty, I am smart, or I am not pretty, I am not smart, I am ugly, I am, all the things that we believe about ourselves. So anytime you start a sentence with I am, it means that you have built a belief around that statement. So like if I say, write down your I am statements in a positive way. You'll tell me everything you believe about yourself from a positive light. And if I ask you to do the same thing for the negative things, you'll tell me everything you don't do well, right? I am not organized. I am not whatever it is. I can't even think of an example. But one of my things that I vividly remember writing on my paper was I am not capable of letting go of other people's emotions. And what I meant by that back then was that if I experienced a situation where someone had vented to me or someone was sharing very heavy things with me, it always went home with me. I could never let it go. So what I was really referring to was like my experiences as a student at the hospitals. My experiences being a First Steps therapist in Kentucky, where I worked with birth to age 3. If there were super stressful situations that parents were telling me about or super awful things I was seeing in the hospital setting, I never could leave it at work. It always came home and it ate at me and it ate at me and it ate at me. And I wanted to be able to fix it and I wanted to make it go away. And what it was doing was it was mentally and emotionally taking a toll on me. So at this retreat, after we did our I am statements and I had said this, I realized like I was really miserable with my job at that point. Like I didn't know the balance of loving my work as an occupational therapist, but still having boundaries for not taking things personally and bringing them home, not feeling like I took responsibility for everybody else's emotions and all the weight and stress that they were carrying, and I brought it home as additional stress into my life. So my I am statement was like, I'm not capable of letting go of other people's stuff. If someone tells me something that's really bothering them, my brain is going to try and fix it for them. I want to fix it for them. And I can't let it go. I'm going to think about it and think about it and think about it until it eats me alive. So what that was resulting in my life was this like dragging misery of like hating going to work for, most days, because if I went to a home that was super, super healthy with beautiful family relationships, it triggered me because it reminded me of things that I didn't always have as a kid. And if I went into a family that felt very chaotic and they screamed to communicate or yelled to communicate, it triggered me because it was like, oh God, this reminds me of the trauma that I endured. And then I would think of that child and what it was doing to them. And then I would go home and think nonstop about this child. So I would either go home and think about a child that was super safe and loved and just cry my eyes out because I was so blessed that they had that. And, thinking in my brain, like, I hope that they know that how beautiful of parents that they have. And then on the other hand, if I, was around situations that felt very chaotic or traumatic to me, I was always thinking of like, oh my God, this child, like, what if their parents don't get them into therapy? Or what if their parents never work on themselves? What if their parents are not self-aware? Like, how is this going to impact the way that this kid grows up? Are they going to end up like me? Are they going to have the same resources and tools, or are they just going to grow up and not know that there's another way out? So everything about work triggered me back then. And I was explaining this to my coaches at the retreat. Well, then the next day comes and they have us all sit down in the living room for this little powwow power coaching session. And as I get to my turn, I'm feeling that horrible feeling in your throat when you need to cry so bad and you're trying so hard not to cry and it feels like a big rock, like you swallowed a rock. It's awful. And I could feel that I needed to cry, and I kind of started to cry a little bit. And one of the coaches there said, okay, so do you see how you got yourself here? Like, do you see it? And I kind of looked at her and I was like, no. And she said, you don't see how all of this you've created. Like, you've created all of this misery in your life. Do you see that? And I was so angry. Oh my God, I was beyond angry. Like, I love these coaches, obviously. I still coach with them. But I was angry because I didn't see it. And I was like, how can they take this and turn it around on me? Like, I've just shared the most traumatic things that weren't my fault but yet they're telling me that the way that I feel today is my fault. And I just didn't see it. I was still in a very victim mentality. And I kind of looked at her and I was like, I literally don't see it. And she goes, you don't see the pattern that is happening right now. Like, you don't see how you've created this in your life. And she goes, tell me your most traumatic childhood memory. And at this point, I was so irritated. I'm like, I have already talked about this traumatic memory like 2 other times on this trip. Like, you all should know the story by now. Like, I felt like, why are you asking me the same questions? Why are you making me repeat this awful traumatic memory over and over again? Like, I was just so irritated. And so I repeat the traumatic memory again, and I go, I was 2 years old. I remember this person coming into my room to grab my wrist to tell me that we had to go. I remember another person coming towards us. I remember being extremely afraid until we got in the car and we left. And she says, yes. And how old were you? And I was like, I was 2. And she goes, yes. And who do you work with now? And when she said that to me, my brain crumbled in what felt like a million tiny pieces. Like, it would be like getting smacked by a piece of brick. Like, it just jarred every cell in my body. Because when she said, and who do you work with now? It was like, for the first time, I realized, and I started sobbing, and I go, I work with 2-year-olds. And I just had a full-blown meltdown. And after I got myself together a little bit, she said, yes, because your most traumatic childhood memory happened when you were 2, and your brain, what it tried to do was protect you from ever experiencing that trauma ever again. And so your 2-year-old little decision-making brain tried to skip through life, making all the opposite decisions from that trauma. Like, it tried to avoid it at every cost. So every decision you made it with subconscious trauma in mind. But what happened is even after 17 years of therapy, of talking about it, you never actually healed it. You never actually learned how to work through it and really heal it to where it no longer controlled you. Okay. So she said, so even after 17 years of talking about it, because it wasn't healed, you continued to make decisions from your 2-year-old self. And what your brain does is it always looks for comfort. So even though it thought it was making decisions to protect you, it was actually making decisions from a place of what's comfortable. And what was comfortable is what your 2-year-old knew and recognized as familiar. So you became an adult that was still harboring all this trauma even after 17 years of therapy, and you made all of your decisions, and guess where you ended up? Becoming an occupational therapist, working with 2-year-olds, just like your little 2-year-old self. And she said, and what you're doing now is as an adult, your little 2-year-old brain is coming out and engaging with these other 2-year-olds, trying so hard to feel safe. And every time you don't feel safe in an environment that you get in, you're triggered because you go back to your 2-year-old self. Like, how did I get here? I'm trying to run away from this. How did I get here? And every time you feel safe, you're triggered because you're like, this is what I always wanted. This is what I've been seeking. So as she explained this, I mean, my brain exploded, and they did it with every single woman in the group. And so every single woman was able to see why they were where they were today. And it was incredible to see that even after so many years of therapy, because for a lot of us, it wasn't actually healed and we didn't know how our brains worked, we had put ourselves back in the same exact situation somehow. Like, the patterns that we were seeing in our life that we were unhappy with were all a result of the trauma we had tried to avoid for our entire life. That was worth every bit of $1,000 a day. I'd pay it 10,000 times over. I would figure out any way possible to be able to, like, even still to this day, I find any way possible to get any kind of coaching for my blind spots, because that's what I would recognize. That's what coaches help you do, is help you recognize blind spots so that you can go back to those areas that you're avoiding and actually move forward. We help you find your patterns. It was priceless. To me, you can't put a price tag on that. The price tag of coaching your brain. You know what I mean? It's easy. Of course, it's easier to buy concert tickets and clothing that you want from the mall and spend your money on anything else other than your brain. Because you have stories around, it's too much money, I shouldn't spend this amount of money. But the reason that all of this came up is because I'm spending more time with my niece and I'm looking at life as it's happening day by day. And I'm just thinking of how we don't always recognize as adults that if we are not looking at our stuff, we're subconsciously making decisions that we think may be totally fine. But are they? So that's why you want to look at, am I living my highest self life? Like, am I living the way that I want to be living? Like, am I getting the results in my life that I want to have? Do I actually feel fulfilled? Do I actually feel happy? Or am I going through the motions? Am I buffering through my whole life? Am I numbing away my stress? Am I avoiding things that I need to look at because it would feel very, very painful? Like, when you're listening to this, do you feel triggered in that you know there's things you need to work on, but then it's like, I don't want to schedule the consult. I don't want to spend the money. I don't want to take the time. Like, do you feel triggered that way? Or do you feel like, I actually feel really good in my life? Like, nothing, I would change nothing. That's kind of the difference to know. And I think for me, by the time I got to coaching, I had realized that for me, I needed something to change. And I've talked with friends this week about this, actually a lot in the last 2 weeks, because we were discussing like the real difference of therapy and coaching. And I know that I've kind of talked about it on the podcast, and I said, every day I'm thankful for my 17 years of therapy, because for 17 years I was validated for all the trauma that I had endured. Like, every bit of trauma. I was never told I was wrong. I was never told that I was crazy or I shouldn't have felt that way. I needed to be heard for 17 years to expel all of the trauma, right? Really say it out loud and have someone I felt safe with to do that, or multiple people throughout my life to feel safe enough to do that. And hearing, being told you're not crazy. Of course that's hard. Of course that's traumatic. No, that absolutely will impact you. That is what my up to 24-year-old self needed. I needed that. And that's why even when I have a consult with someone, if they're talking about how they've never gone to therapy and they're really, really struggling and they don't even know where to begin, instead of recommending that they work with me, I will go recommend that they try therapy, try multiple therapists if they can't find the right one in the beginning, because that's invaluable to have someone that is listening to you, is helping you see why maybe like, okay, of course you feel that way. That validation of like, of course, like that's not okay. Like, that is so important. I think the difference is that by the time I got 17 years through therapy, I realized I was still angry at the people that had hurt me. I was still repeating the same stories over and over again. It felt like a hamster wheel that I was never going to get off of. It felt like every week I'm rehashing the same things. And every time I rehash the same things, I feel the same emotions. And I had this thought process of like, I'm never going to feel better unless those people change, or those people say they're sorry, or those people are different. And what I realized is that you cannot control any other person. So the only remaining factor was me. So whenever I started working with my coach, I realized that the difference was I started learning how to deal with my stuff, actually heal it, to be able to move forward and create a future I was excited about, not one that is built around subconscious past trauma that I might not even know is there. Like my coach has helped me learn, well, here's how you keep making decisions. Let's figure out why. That was invaluable, and still is to this day. Like, I still work with coaches and learn that why I'm thinking something. And sometimes it will go back to rehashing something of the past of like, oh, but not to actually revisit it and stay there and be validated, to figure out what it is and be like, okay, well, I don't want that anymore. Like, I'm done with that. Thank you for validating me. Thank you for letting me know I'm not crazy, but I don't want to feel that way anymore. So I need to move forward. So how can we do that? Like that's that I want a different result. And I think like being around my niece, this has been coming up a lot more for me because, my husband and I are 30. We want to have 2 to 3 children. We've talked about doing that when, we're both entrepreneurs now. So we want to be more financially in a better place where we're also not griping and complaining about finances or stressed and that, not raising our kids around that. I was raised in that. My husband was raised in that. And that was very traumatic for me as a kid, constantly hearing stress of adults with finances and what we could and couldn't afford. And that alone, that exposure, wired me with so many money stories of my own. Like that was one of the reasons it was hard for me to pay for any kind of coaching out of my pocket. It was like, I couldn't talk to my family about it because they would never understand why I would want to spend $3,000 in 3 days. They think that that's stupid because they have lack around money. And therefore I had lack around money. I had been taught to be afraid and be frugal and that, once you spend it, it's not coming back and you have to work really, really hard for your money. And all of that is bullshit stories that keep you stuck. I will just say that. I have learned that. So if you're there, I get it. Those are just stories that you've heard, stories that feel very true because of what you witnessed. And it's all trauma. It's all trauma around money, okay? Because money comes in, money goes out. Money is a resource. Money is not bad. It is not the root of all evil. It will not make you a bad person. Money accentuates who you already are at your core. If you're already bad, it will be like heightened whenever you have a lot of money. If you're a good person with your money and you're already giving what little you have, you'll do that same thing when you have more money. It's people have so many negative stories around their money, and it's just all trauma and things that you were raised around and all of that BS. So I've done a lot of work and spent a lot of money to get out of that lack mentality of being so afraid that if I spend something, it's not going to come back, or if I do it, it's going to mean that I'm a horrible person, or I'm not being smart, or I'm not budgeting, like all of that. I can go down a whole rabbit hole with that, but I don't even remember what my point was with that. But I think what I was talking about is that it takes work to rewire all of that. And with my husband and I knowing that we want to have kids, I think this is actually what I was talking about. We're wanting to get to a place where we're very self-aware so that we can understand our triggers. So when I'm around my niece and I feel something in my body like, anxiety, or if I feel any kind of stress, I want to understand where that's coming from to make sure that I'm never taking my my emotions, which I might be unaware of in the moment, out on an innocent being, whether it's a baby, a child, another adult, a friend, a coworker. Like that's the whole point of emotional intelligence. It's knowing how to recognize your own emotions, have your own awareness so that you know how to cope in a healthy way, and you're never taking your subconscious patterns and placing them on someone else. And that's a lot of intentional hard ass work. So as we were talking about, I've been talking about with friends lately about therapy versus coaching, and like what the differences are that we've experienced. And we've been talking about like our traumas and how we see those patterns playing out in our day-to-day decisions and what we need to do to switch them. And then when I get around my niece, I just think like, oh my gosh, I flash forward to my own kids, and I just thank God that by the time that I have my own kids, I will never be a perfect parent. I will always be making mistakes. And I know that. I'm not naive to that. I know I'm going to have bad days. But I just thank God for the awareness that I will have going into being a mom in my, early to mid 30s versus if I had started having kids really young. And here's the thing, like even if you already have kids, even if your kids are 17, 18, 25, it doesn't matter. At any given point, you have the opportunity to change. You have the opportunity to look at your stuff. I have clients everywhere from their 20s all the way to their mid 60s. And it's never too late to say, I want to grab this now and work on this now. You're not too late. You always have the ability to figure out why you're thinking the way you're thinking, why you're making the decisions you're making, why you're getting the results that you're getting. And when you're unhappy with it, you have the opportunity to change it. But that's up to you. Nobody can ever do that work for you. That is why, like, I'm never in anybody's inbox being like, "Oh, you've been posting a lot of, kind of hard things the past 6 months. Do you need coaching?" I will never ever do that, because nobody can change unless they want to. Like that's the first step. So I don't reach out for people, don't ever reach out. Don't market myself in your own personal inboxes trying to get you to come get help, right? You have to want that. You have to schedule the consult. You have to be willing to show up for the call. You have to be willing to, if you're going to invest in yourself, invest in yourself. Like, you have to, even after you invest in yourself, you have to be the one that's going to show up on the coaching calls and show up and do the work and show up and watch, the modules or whatever it is that the program contains. Nobody can do that for you. But I think whenever you start to realize, like, just how much everything's interconnected, like who you are being today is connected to things that have happened to you in the past and decisions that, have been made around you in the past. When you realize that it can be totally different from what you're living right now, I think that it kind of lights a spark under your butt to grab what you can and shift it. And never underestimate the ripple that will have on the people around you, your family, what your kids experience and see. I was talking to a friend who has a child, and actually while we were sharing our traumatic memories, her child was playing a game, Roblox. I mean, if you have a kid that's, in that age range, you kind of know that's probably what they're into right now. But she was listening. And after, we had the conversation amongst ourselves, of course, knowing she was there. And it wasn't like anything bad was being said. So, we allowed her to be there. But what it did was create a safe space for her to open up and share what she feels is her youngest memory at this point. And it was so powerful to sit in that. It was so powerful to sit in that and recognize little tiny things that your brain, like, for the other adult, right, had no idea. And I just think that this work is such a ripple effect. It's so healing. And when you're doing that for yourself and holding that safe space for yourself, you can open up the door to be that person for your kids and your kids' kids and your kids' kids' kids, and create a more healthy, cohesive environment to grow and evolve and know that nothing is impossible. So I know that was a lot, but that is kind of what's been circulating the past several weeks. And I thank God for the ability for us to become self-aware beings and really do the work. So if any of this resonated with you, if you want to work on any of this yourself and figure out what it is that maybe you're doing now that relates to something of your past, feel free, schedule a free consult, 60-minute consult. You can do it on MacyRenee.com. If you know you're a hell yes and you're ever ready, the Equip Society, where you're going to be learning about your emotional intelligence, you're going to get to take an assessment. You have over 40 video modules, and coaching every single week. Like, when you're just a hell yes for that, you don't even have to schedule a consult call. You can literally go to MacyRenee.com, find the Equip Society page, sign up, and then I will be in contact with you within that 24 hours to make sure you're all set up and ready to go. And you can get started on this work to really become more self-aware and change your life, become more emotionally intelligent, and start creating that ripple, not only in your own life, but everybody that you come in contact with, everybody that is around you. I often hear clients say, and they'll come back and say this, like, that people recognize a difference in their energy, in their life, like just going around people will notice how different they are because of how differently they carry themselves when they're aware of things and working on changing. So if I'm someone that can support you and you enjoy the work and you enjoy listening to the podcast and you enjoy being here on the podcast and you need anything, please reach out to me. And I hope that you all have an amazing week, and I will be talking to you real soon. Bye.